الله وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله صلى الله وسلم وبارك على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. مرحبا بكم. The objective, inshallah ta'ala, of the next few classes is to look at the main verses of the Quran that talk about fasting, as well as the main ahadith that speak about fasting. And we've chosen one of the books of hadith particularly to look at its hadith, and that's Umdat al-Ahkam by Hafid Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi al-Hanbali. And the reason for choosing this book is because it's one of the more concise books of hadith. It contains just over 400 hadith, and the author rahimahullah chose the most authentic of hadith because he tried to only include in his book those ahadith which were reported by Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Ibrahim ibn Mughira ibn al-Bardis al-Bukhari, the well-known Imam, who's the author of Al-Jami' al-Sahih, and reported by Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, Abu al-Husayn, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj ibn al-Husayn al-Naysaburi, rahimahullah. Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj ibn Muslim, al-Naysaburi. So, the author tried to only mention a hadith that are agreed upon by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. And because Al-Bukhari and Muslim had the objective of only mentioning the most authentic hadith in their books, this is why, if they agree on a hadith, that makes it from the highest levels of authenticity. And Al-Imam Muslim rahimahullah, when he was asked about some hadith, and one example of that is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِنَّمَا جُعِلَ الْإِمَامُ لِيُتَمَّ بِهِ. The Imam was made to be followed. فَإِذَا كَبَّرَ فَكَبِّرُوا. If he makes takbir, then make takbir. وَإِذَا رَكَعَ فَارْكَعُوا. If he makes ruku', then you make ruku'. Then he said, وَإِذَا قَرَأَ فَأَنصِتُوا. And if he recites, then remain silent. This hadith is reported from one Sahabi, and it was reported from another companion also, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. But Muslim didn't include it in his book. So one of his students said, is this hadith sahih? And he said, yes, it's sahih. So he said, so why didn't you include it in your book? Why did you not include this hadith in your book, Imam Muslim? He says, not everything that's authentic do I mention in this book. إِنَّمَا أَذْكُرُ فِيهِ مَا أَجْمَعُ عَلَيْهِ. I only mention in this book that which is most authentic. That's the general rule. That's the general rule of Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So this is why we've chosen this book, Umdat al-Ahkam. Now, we're not going to look at the verses, and once we finish the verses, look at the ahadith. But we're going to merge them together. Why is it essential, not just important, essential to merge these two things together? The verses of the Quran and the ahadith. The Sunnah explains the Quran. The Sunnah is a tafsir of the Quran. And this is why Imam Ahmad rahimahullah says, السُنَّةُ إِنَّمَا تُفَسِّرُ الْقُرْآنَ وَتُبَيِّنُهُ. The Sunnah only interprets the Quran and clarifies it. And that was the role of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. And we have sent down to you the dhikr. What's the dhikr? The Quran. لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. So that you may clarify to the people what has been revealed to them. What's been revealed to them? The Quran. So we've sent down the Quran so that you can clarify to the people their religion. And this is why the one who detaches the Quran and the ahadith, Quran and the Sunnah, hasn't really understood the approach of Islam. Hasn't understood Islam at all. Because they're picturing Allah's words of the Quran, and the Sunnah is like some extra thing. It's sort of, some people even see the Sunnah as a barrier, a burden. It's a burden, extra burden. And there are so many ahadith, some people, if they could just wipe them out of the books and people's minds, they would do so. Discomfort at the existence of those ahadith. That's because they haven't understood the role of ahadith. hadith, the sunan are there to interpret the Quran. This is why there's a famous difference of opinion between the scholars. Can the sunnah abrogate the Quran? What's abrogate? What's the Arabic word for abrogate? Nasakh. Okay. ما ننسخ من آية أو ننسها نأتي بخير منها ومثلها. Nasakh is something spoken about in the Quran. Nasakh means to abrogate. What does that mean? Replace. Or a ruling that existed, or a verse, or something that existed at one point is then overruled. It's almost like an overruling. Like you have in courts of law, you have the Court of Appeal make a judgment, but if the Supreme Court makes a judgment, that's considered an overriding judgment over the Court of Appeal, because the Supreme Court is a court that is higher than the Court of Appeal. Same here. Allah Ta'ala may choose to make something legislation at one point, but after that He decides to remove it. Why? For a wisdom of His. That's why Allah Ta'ala said in the Quran, when He spoke about abrogation, ما ننسخ من آية أو ننسها نأتي بخير منها أو مثلها ألم تعلم أن الله على كل شيء قدير. Do you not know that Allah is able to do all things? ألم تعلم أن الله له ملك السماوات والأرض. Do you not know that Allah has ownership of the heavens and the earth? Meaning Allah is able to do anything, and Allah is the most wise. So if He decides to make something a part of the Quran at one point and then removes it from the Quran at another point, is there an issue? There shouldn't be an issue. It's the word of Allah Ta'ala. So why did I talk about that? The scholars disagree. Can the Sunnah abrogate a verse of the Quran? So Allah mentions something in the Quran, and then the Sunnah comes and overrides it. Is that possible? Why not? If you say it's not possible, why is it not possible? So we have a verse in the Quran, and then a hadith comes and overrules the Quran. So therefore that verse no longer applies, but now the hadith applies instead. I'm sure this must have come across some of you. Is that something possible? Those of you who say it's not possible, why do you think it would not? Both are scholarly opinions, by the way. So either way, you're gonna be siding with one group of scholars, but you need to explain why.
There shouldn't be anything in authentic hadith that contradicts.
But we are saying that there are verses of Quran that are contradicting the Quran. Yani verses of Quran can abrogate the Quran.
And the Sunnah is the best explanation.
طيب. So
it doesn't outright contradict it, but it
further explains it.
explains the meaning of
طيب. Is it possible though for there to be a direct contradiction? Meaning it's impossible for both of these to remain. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَالَّذِينَ يَتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ وَعَشْرًا. Those of you who pass away and leave behind wives, the wives should remain 4 months and 10 days, the iddah. And in another verse, وَالَّذِينَ يَتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا وَصِيَّةً لِأَزْوَاجِهِمْ مَتَاعًا إِلَى الْحَوْلِ غَيْرَ إِخْرَاجٍ. Those of you who pass away and leave behind wives, then they should remain behind for a whole year. إِلَى الْحَوْلِ. This is direct contradiction. It can't be both 1 year and 4 months and 10 days. Those scholars who said it's impossible for it to abrogate, what did they say? They said the Sunnah is not like a separate revelation. The Sunnah is there to explain the Quran. So how can the tafsir abrogate the Asl? And this is the position of Imam Ahmad and the Shafi'i. They say, how can that which is the tafsir of the Quran abrogate the Quran? The Sunnah is only there to explain the Quran. So if the Sunnah brings an extra meaning, you would always find it goes back to the Quran. And this is something inshallah we'll notice throughout these classes. We will find that almost every hadith mentioned from those hadith mentioned here, it will go back to one of the verses. It will go back to one of the verses. Either explicitly go back to one of those verses, or it will go back towards the general statement in one of the verses of the Quran. This is a really important thing. It's a very, very important methodology when it comes to understanding the Sharia. That the Quran is there, the word of Allah is the Asl, the Sunnah is part of it. The Sunnah is part of it. It's there to explain the Quran, clarify the Quran. And this is why, subhanAllah, a lot of the times when someone criticizes certain ahadith, they don't realize that in reality you're going to end up criticizing the Quran. Because the Sunnah is nothing but a continuation from the ahadith. And some people, for example, criticize the ahadith of sihr, the sihr of the Prophet ﷺ. Even though the exact same incident occurs in the Quran. Allah Ta'ala says about Musa, يُخَيَّلُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ سِحْرِهِمْ أَنَّهَا تَسْعَى. The sihr of the magicians, the magic of the magicians, made Musa imagine that these were snakes that were roaming around. And the Prophet ﷺ's incident was no different. The Aisha radiallahu anha says, حَتَّى أَنَّهُ يُخَيَّلُ إِلَيْهِ أَنَّهُ يَفْعَلُ الشَّيْءَ وَلَا يَفْعَلُهُ. The Prophet ﷺ sometimes would have imagined that something happened and it didn't really happen. The one who protected Musa, some people say, how can this happen? This is a prophet of God, he is teaching us the Quran, etc. So what? The one who protected Musa and allowed him to deliver the message completely is the one who protects the Prophet ﷺ and allows him to deliver the message completely. ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ. Then it's upon us to clarify it, the Quran. Allah has kept it to Himself. He's promised Himself to preserve the Quran and to explain the Quran. Not just to preserve the words of the Quran, to explain it. ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ. Then it is upon us to explain it to the people. Meaning, some of the tabi'een said, as well as some of the salaf, the sahaba, ثُمَّ إِنَّ عَلَيْنَا بَيَانَهُ. Then it is upon us to show its halal and haram. So that's the approach, inshallah, of these classes. And this is generally an approach that we should take when understanding anything about Islam. Look at the verses of the Quran that I mentioned about this issue. Then look at the ahadith mentioned, and those ahadith will explain to you those verses. To the extent that Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah is reported to have said, there is not a single hadith which does not go back to a verse of the Quran. There's not a single hadith that is authentic which doesn't find its origin in the Quran. So this connection, that we have to realize this connection is a strong one. طيب. So we'll be doing that, inshallah. We'll be looking at the verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, because the verses of fasting in Surah Al-Baqarah are from verses 183 to 187. 5 verses talk about fasting, not that much detail. There's 5 verses for something that's considered one of the pillars of Islam. There isn't that much detail. And this is actually the nature of the Quran. Generally speaking, the Quran gives you the general rules, and the Sunnah explains further. There are some exceptions. There are some exceptions where the Quran explains the detail, and the Sunnah gives you the general rule. Anyone know an example? Inheritance, very good. Allah Ta'ala mentions inheritance in detail, but we don't have too many ahadith on inheritance. Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَعْطَى كُلَّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقَّهُ. Allah has given everyone who is worthy of a right, his right. فَلَا وَصِيَّةَ لِوَارِثٍ. So there's no wasiyyah, there's no will for an inheritor. General rule, general statement. It sounds more like a verse of the Quran. But the verses of inheritance are detailed. And there's of course a wisdom behind that, because inheritance is something that people dispute over a lot. So that's the approach bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. We'll look at the verses of the Quran, and then we'll each time refer back to Umdat al-Ahkam and look at the ahadith which come from it in relation to these verses. This book, alhamdulillah, Umdat al-Ahkam, is one of the most widely spread books. It's been explained by many scholars. It's been translated into English. So it's, alhamdulillah, available. And the author, rahimahullah, mentioned the ahadith which give us rulings, halal and haram. He focused on those things. He didn't focus on the verses of aqidah, creed, nor did he focus on the verses of different types of worship and dhikr and dua, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, kutiba alaykum as-siyamu, kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, la'allakum tattaqun. O you who believe, kutiba alaykum as-siyam. Writing has been, fasting has been written upon you, decreed upon you, prescribed for you. كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, as it was written upon those who came before you. And the previous nations used to fast also. The Jews and the Christians have fasting. The Jews and the Christians both have fasting. And the Jews, until today, consider some days to be days of fasting, compulsory days of fasting. And the Jews and Christians have the concept of fasting from food and drink and relations. That concept exists with Christians as well as the Jews. However, Christians seem to be more relaxed about obligating fasting. And the Christians also, or many Christians, I don't want to say the Christians because I'm not an expert on Christianity, so if I do some research on Christianity, it's always going to be limited research. But some Christians consider that fasting is a recommendation. The Bible that we have today talks about Jesus fasting for 40 days. And some Christians argue that the objective of fasting is to come closer to God, which is the same thing that Allah mentions in the Quran, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you may obtain God consciousness. And so because of that, some of the Christians say that you can fast from anything. So you can choose something to abstain from. It could be foods, it could be certain types of drinks, it could be certain activities. So long as you're keeping away from anything that relates to this world, all of that counts as a valid fast. And don't be surprised to see that some Muslims, either now or in the near future, will interpret the verses of fasting to be the same thing. Because the Prophet ﷺ says that تَتَّبِعُنَّ سَنَنَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ شِبْرًا بِشِبْرٍ ذِرَاعًا بِذِرَاعٍ. You shall indeed, surely follow the footsteps of those who came before you. Step by step. When the Sahaba said, الْيَهُودُ وَالنَّصَارَى, the Jews and the Christians, قَالَ فَمَنْ? He said, who else? And so this is why, subhanAllah, one of our shuyukh says, if you want to know the future of Muslims, look at the history of Christians. If you want to know the future of Muslims, look at the history of the Christians. Because the approach is very similar. And subhanAllah, we see that. We really do. And this is why this opening up of interpreting the Bible as you wish, that's happening with Islam as well. It's happening with Islam. Fasting is about getting closer to God, isn't it? Yeah, Allah says so in the Quran. So if I can get closer to God by keeping away from just food, but I still have drinks, then that's fine, because I'm still doing something to get closer to God. And so, watch out for this tafsir coming soon, inshaAllah ta'ala, and be sure to connect it back to how the Christians have approached their religion. Because the Quran is here to stay till Yawm al-Qiyamah. The teachings of Islam, minhu ayatun muhkamat. From the Quran are verses that are muhkam, clear cut. No, it doesn't have more than one interpretation. وَأُخَرَ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ, and few others that are maybe open to interpretation. So Allah Ta'ala says, كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. Allah talks about a number of the prophets fasting. Allah talks about a number of the prophets fasting. He says about Ismail, for example, وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ إِسْمَعِيلٍ إِنَّهُ كَانَ صَادِقَ الْوَعْدِ وَكَانَ رَسُولًا نَبِيًّا. And recall in the book Ismail. Then he says, وَكَانَ يَأْمُرُ أَهْلَهُ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَالزَّكَاةِ وَكَانَ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِ مَرْضِيًّا. And he used to command his people to perform salah and to give zakah. And he was from those who are beloved and Allah is pleased with. So salah was there, zakah was there, fasting is there, and hajj was there. Ibrahim, Allah Ta'ala says to Ibrahim, وَأَذِّنْ فِي النَّاسِ بِالْحَجِّ, and announced to the people the hajj. So the 5 pillars of Islam existed before. And this shows, and we've touched upon this before, this shows that Islam is a continuous religion. From the time of Adam till today, till the day of judgment. It's one religion. As the Prophet ﷺ says, Al-Anbiya'u ikhwatun min allat. The prophets are brothers. Ummahatuhum shatta. Their mothers are different. Wa dinuhum wahid. But their deen is one, their religion is one. So the previous nations fasted. Linguistically, siyam is to abstain. as a general meaning. And of course, as you know, Arabic words can sometimes have many roots. But generally speaking, the word siyam, sama, sawman, is to abstain from something, to keep away from something. Anything. And that's why Allah Ta'ala says about Maryam, فَقُولِي إِنِّي نَذَرْتُ لِلرَّحْمَنِ صَوْمًا. I have taken an oath to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala to perform a sawm, a fast. What's that fast? Silence. فَلَنْ أُكَلِّمَ الْيَوْمَ إِنْسِيًّا. So today I shall not speak to any person. So her fasting was fasting from speaking. That fasting is abrogated now. So if a person was to fast from speaking, we say that's not a legal fast, but still silence is recommended in the Sharia anyway. And the Prophet ﷺ says, مَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ. Whoever believes in Allah on the final day, then let him speak good or remain silent. Allah Ta'ala says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that you may obtain taqwa. Taqwa is what? Taqwa means awareness and consciousness of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Being mindful of God. And that's a more appropriate and more general and more accurate as well translation than just fear. Yeah? Fearing God. Taqwa is to fear God. Because our understanding of fear is looking at fear from one angle. It's a limited understanding. When we say fearing God, we're picturing somebody who's scared. Picturing somebody who's scared. Taqwa is richer than that. Taqwa is more than that. Because when a person has taqwa, does something out of taqwa, does something because of their mindfulness of God, it could be because of their love of Allah Ta'ala, it could be because of their gratitude towards Allah Ta'ala, it could be because of their fear of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, it could be because of their hope in Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. These are all meanings that come under the concept of taqwa. So it's more than just simply the standard English understanding of fear. And this is why awareness of God and consciousness of God is maybe a bit more accurate. And translations, of course, are always restricted when it comes to getting a meaning across. But it's better than the term fear. So that you may be mindful of God. Why? Because when a person keeps away from some of the pleasures of the dunya, that leaves space for focusing on Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and it leaves space for focusing on the akhirah. When our focus is delving into the matters of the dunya, then for our hearts to leave a wide space for the akhirah and for Allah Ta'ala is very difficult, because space is already occupied. Space is occupied. And therefore, if we're spending our time with useless information, then guess what? That's going to take up space, and it means that beneficial information is going to be reduced. Because we're human beings, there's only so much we can take in. That applies to both knowledge, and it also applies to what we're attached to. What we're attached to. And so, when we are encouraged to keep away from food, and encouraged to keep away from drink, and encouraged to keep away from relations, these are the most apparent and the most obvious types of desires and pleasures of this world. So if we are disciplining ourselves and teaching ourselves to keep away from these things until it's acceptable for us to go on to these things, then that teaches us self-restraint. It teaches us to say, I'm not going to do this because it's not allowed. And if we can keep away from things that are halal, then we will be even more capable of keeping away from things that are haram. If we know that something is halal, and something is a natural desire, every person has a natural desire for food, and for drink, and for the opposite gender. These are natural desires. We don't need to be taught to have these desires. We don't need to be taught to have these desires. That's why the Quran and Sunnah doesn't teach us to have these desires, but it teaches us some guidelines around them. And so, if we are capable of keeping away from natural desires which we know are permissible and mubah, then when it comes to things which go against the fitrah, or are in line with the fitrah but they're transgressions in the fitrah. Zina, for example. Although it's generally in line with the fitrah of men being attracted to women, but it's a transgression in the fitrah. It's a transgression. And so, if we are capable of restraining ourselves from things that are natural and permissible, then we're going to be more capable of keeping ourselves away from things that are prohibited. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ said, when he was showing us the proper fast, what constitutes a proper fast, he said, مَنْ لَمْ يَدَعْ قَوْلَ الزُّورِ وَالْعَمَلَ بِهِ فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ فِي أَنْ يَدَعَ طَعَامَهُ وَشَرَابَهُ. And the hadith is in Sahihain. The one who does not leave off qawl al-zur, evil speech, false speech, وَالْعَمَلَ بِهِ, and acting upon it, فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ فِي أَنْ يَدَعَ طَعَامَهُ وَشَرَابَهُ. Then Allah is not in need of you leaving your food and your drink. That means your fast is incomplete. Legally it's correct, so you don't have to repeat that fast after Ramadan. But spiritually, it's incomplete. Spiritually, it's incomplete. Why? Because the objective is to restrain yourself from halal. You're going beyond that, and you're falling into haram. The objective is to restrain ourselves from things that are mubah for a set period of time. So when we are falling into things that are sinful and prohibited, that means we are going against the objective of fasting, which is to be mindful of God. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, أَيَّامًا مَعْدُودَاتٍ. And this is the following verse. أَيَّامًا مَعْدُودَاتٍ. A set number of days. Meaning fasting is required of you for a set number of days. Fasting, generally speaking, was obligatory before the fasting of Ramadan. And this is why, as reported in the Sahihain, that the fast of Ashura was initially an obligatory fast. Fasting Ashura. Ashura is which day of the year? 10th of Muharram. 10th of Muharram. That fast was compulsory to begin with. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated Ramadan, when He obligated Ramadan, Ramadan became compulsory and Ashura no longer was compulsory. فَمَنْ شَاءَ صَامَ وَمَنْ شَاءَ أَفْطَرَ, as Abdullah ibn Umar says. So whoever wishes can fast it, and whoever wishes cannot fast it. And of course, fasting it is a sunnah and it's recommended, but it's no longer a compulsory fast. أَيَّامًا مَعْدُودَاتٍ, a set number of days. But it doesn't quite specify those days yet. But in the following verse, Allah is going to specify those days and say, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن, until He says after that, فمن شهد منكم الشهر فليصوم. So whoever of you witnesses the month of Ramadan, then let him fast it. So we know that Allah's statement here, a set number of days, is referring to Ramadan. It's referring to Ramadan because the Quran interprets itself, especially if the verses are in one context. Especially if verses are in one context. فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. Those of you who are ill or traveling, then a set number of other days. Meaning, if you're traveling or you're sick, you're ill, then you have the concession, you have the option of breaking your fast. And if you do end up breaking your fast, then you must fast the same number of days that you've missed on other days, outside of Ramadan. Outside of Ramadan. And that means that it is not possible to make up fasts in Ramadan. How can someone make up a fast in Ramadan? It won't be valid, but how could someone do that in the first place?
Probably donating,
it wouldn't be considered legally a fast, because he's not abstaining from food, drink, relations, etc. Maybe somebody's traveling, and instead of fasting that day, says, I'm going to fast the day that I missed last year. So it's not valid. You can't do that. Because Allah Ta'ala says, فَعِدَّةٌ مِنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. Then a set number of other days. A set number of other days. And also Ramadan is here. If you can fast, fast Ramadan. What's the point in making up a previous fast and you have a current fast to make up or to fast? فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا, whoever of you is ill. The Sunnah doesn't really talk about what's illness. What counts as an illness which allows you to break your fast? So what are we supposed to do in this case?
Go to your doctor.
And what's the doctor going to say?
Well, if you need to take medication,
Yeah.
that's an excuse for you.
Okay, maybe.
Isn't it if you throw up as well? That's breaks your fast. If you
It doesn't break the fast, but we'll come to it in a minute.
Is it all based on personal judgments?
The Prophet ﷺ left it to people. He left it to the individual. And that's why, and this is a rule, this is a general rule. It's the individual that decides what hardship is. I don't look at someone who's sitting down praying, and I say, why are you sitting down? He says, I'm really struggling to stand up. No, you're okay, stand up. That's not my decision to make. That's his decision to make. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, صَلِّ قَائِمًا, pray standing. فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ, if you are not able to, فَقَاعِدًا, then pray sitting. No one's going to give you an answer and tell you, okay, now it looks like you've reached enough pain to sit down. Or it looks like you're in so much pain that you can break your fast. It goes back to the individual. And imagine, somebody came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, O Messenger of Allah, and we'll come back to this hadith later, O Messenger of Allah, I've ruined myself. Halakt. قال وما أهلكك? He said, what is it that's ruined you? He said, I had relations with my wife whilst I was fasting. So the Prophet ﷺ said to him, do you find a slave to free? He said, no. He said, can you fast 2 consecutive months? He said, no. Whenever I read this hadith, it comes to and it always crossed my mind. The man was just fasting. He was just fasting now. And when the Prophet ﷺ said to him, can you fast 2 consecutive months? He said, no, I can't. That's it. He didn't say to him, but you were fasting just now. How can you suddenly not be able to fast? Straight away, when he said, I can't fast, he said, can you feed 60 poor people? He said, no. So the Prophet ﷺ again didn't search for his wealth and check whether he's rich enough. And he didn't ask him, why can you suddenly not fast? He left it to him. Even though, from reading the story apparently, it sounds like he was a man who was fasting, capable of fasting, able to fast. But maybe 60 consecutive days was too much for him. Maybe he wasn't able to. And in some narrations he says, it was fasting that got me into this in the first place. Fasting is what got me into this in the first place. And still the Prophet ﷺ allowed him to make that judgment. He gave him the choice to make that judgment. So if a person is not transgressing, because at the end of the day it's between a person and Allah. And this is really something that we have to encourage sometimes, more than just encouraging the nitty-gritty of the law. This is allowed, this is not allowed, your hair is slightly showing, should be more like this. No, this is not correct, this is incorrect. No, if you do this, it's not that. That's part of Islam. But at the same time, there should be an encouraging of people accounting themselves to Allah. Between you and Allah. Leave it to you. That's up to you. Yeah? We leave things to people. We leave things to people. Not assume the worst, not assume the negative, but leave things to people. And the person who wants to be lazy and negligent and do things when he knows he shouldn't be doing them, that's between him and Allah. And the person who's genuine, alhamdulillah, Allah's given him an excuse. Allah's given him an excuse. If you are ill, then you can break your fast. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says regarding the eating of the flesh of swine or the dead meta, animals which haven't been slaughtered properly. He said, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. The one who's in need, the one who finds himself in a case of necessity, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ, but without transgressing, وَلَا عَادٍ, and without crossing the limits, فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ, then there's no sin upon him. And we can apply that same rule to this. If a person genuinely finds hardship in fasting, either because he needs to take medication, which a doctor prescribes for him or recommends him to take, or either because he finds himself in extreme tiredness and hardship and so on, the decision goes back to the person. The decision goes back to the person to decide whether he should break his fast or not. Of course, we are talking about a hardship that is beyond the natural. You can't say, I'm feeling hungry, you know. Of course. Fasting is, hunger is part of fasting. So to turn around and say, I'm feeling hungry, I want to break my fast, that's not an excuse in the first place. Allah Ta'ala said, فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا, the one who's ill. And being ill means you're outside of the natural state. You're no longer in a natural state of hunger, but now you're actually in a situation of hardship that is more than normal, more than natural. It doesn't mean you're about to die. It doesn't have to be, if you don't eat now, you're going to die. Only then can you break your fast. It doesn't have to go to that extent. In fact, some of the tabi'een were so lenient on this verse, and it's a minority of them, which is why they were kind of questioned about this opinion of theirs. But some of them were so lenient that if they felt any type of pain or even a cut or something like that, they would eat and drink. And this is reported from Muhammad ibn Sirin, rahimahullah. But nonetheless, that wasn't really a practiced thing. But the point is, illness goes back to the individual. He decides whether they're in a situation where they're incapable of fasting or it's too much for them to fast. They break that fast on that day, and then they repeat that fast on another day.
You find a lot of people that refer to Ramadan for other issues. Obviously,
A lot of people?
they will refer to Ramadan
Yeah.
for whatever condition they're suffering from. Because it's obviously a medical condition. And people don't allow based on them like I can tell them different things. So that's one sound of the issue. Can there be differences in the answer?
About whether to break or not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing is leaving it for the individual. You have people breaking their fast because they have hay fever.
Yeah.
Because so you have that side to leave it to the person, or you have the other side of going to all that. And how would you recommend it?
Firstly, there's no doubt that if something, and for those who didn't hear, the question's about sometimes a person, if they're ill or incapable of fasting, they might go to a scholar or someone to answer their question. Is it possible for them to receive different answers? Yeah. And secondly, if we leave it to the person, then he might cross the boundaries and break his fast because he's got hay fever or something along those lines. The role of the scholar is not to tell you how ill you are, because that's you. But the role of the scholar may be to give you a guideline on how to approach your situation. That can be helpful. Someone might think, for example, that if they take an injection, it breaks the fast. So they say to a scholar, I'm fasting, but I've been told that I have to take an injection every 2 hours, or every 3 hours. They might be under the impression that it breaks the fast. They might go to a scholar and the scholar says, no, that's fine. It doesn't break your fast. So here the scholar's not telling them whether they have to take their medicine or not, because that's a medical thing. That's something for the doctor to tell you. But the role of the scholar is to give them an idea of how to approach their situation. And then there might be a difference, because another scholar might say, if it's in an injection, it does break the fast. So therefore, if you have to take an injection, you can eat and drink that day, and then make it up after Ramadan. So there might be some difference when it comes to that issue. But the role of the scholar is not to tell us how ill you are, and he's not there to tell us whether we can take our medicine or not take our medicine. Regarding leaving things to people, some people might abuse that. We say, of course people might abuse that. But the Sharia has left a lot of things to people, and people abuse it. Hasn't the Sharia given talaq to the man? The man gives talaq. Yeah? Do men abuse talaq? Yes, they do. Does that mean the Sharia doesn't give them that right because they're abusing it? They have that right, and they're ready for questioning on the Day of Judgment. Because we have dunya and we have akhirah. Because at the end of the day, these are individual practices. It's not possible to, hold people by the hand and take them step by step in everything they do. So no doubt, if something is left to the people, then that might come into it. But it's the same thing that we've just said about this verse, about the one who's in need of eating food and only finds pork, or only finds maita. Allah says, فَمَنِ الطُّرْ, the one who finds himself in need, in necessity. He told people not to transgress, but he also gave people the concession and the permission to eat if they need to. That's left to the people. Maybe one person says that I don't need to eat, and the other person with only a tiny bit of fear says I really need to eat because I'm worried I might die. What can we do? And there's not much more that can be done to this person. And this is why I say that sometimes we need to encourage the concept of taqwa and the concept of being conscious of Allah and building a proper, sincere relationship with Allah, as opposed to just the law. Because if we speak about just the law, firstly, you're going to burden people to a certain extent, and secondly, it's a misunderstanding of the religion, because Islam didn't just come like that. It didn't come to make us robots. It appreciates that we're human beings. So yes, of course people are going to abuse it. People can abuse it. And that's why we say, don't abuse it. That's it. That's the only thing that a person can do. That's the only role that a teacher or a alim or a mufti can have here. Say if you feel that you are incapable of fasting, break your fast. I can't hold him and say, are you sure? Are you sure you can't? Try to continue fasting. No, it's completely up to you. Just like the Prophet ﷺ didn't think twice about this person who came to him and said, I can't fast consecutive months. Straight away he said, okay, in that case, can you feed 64 people? And alhamdulillah, that creates a bit of space for people, because people are different. And one of the shuyukh came from Saudi Arabia, and he found it cold here in the UK. So he made tayammum. How cold was it? 13 degrees. 13 degrees, I said 13 degrees is summer for us. He finds it so cold that he made tayammum in the morning, woke up for Fajr, made tayammum and prayed Salah. What are we going to say to him? Say he's not cold enough? And it's something that we consider, no, that's just wrong. You can't do that. That's not the point, but the point here is that when things are left to the individual, it gives people a bit of scope. And there are examples of that in the Sunnah, in the Quran, and in the practice of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. طيب, so فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ, the one who's ill can break his fast, regardless of whether they started the day fasting or not. Maybe they started the day fasting and they tried to keep their fast, but in the end they found that it's too much, so they break their fast. That's up to them. It goes back to them, as we said. Similar to the person who's ill is the woman who's pregnant or breastfeeding. The majority of scholars don't distinguish between someone who's ill or a normal person, someone who's in a normal situation, natural state, and between a woman who's pregnant or breastfeeding. Because women who are pregnant or breastfeeding can fast, and they do fast. And not every woman that's pregnant or breastfeeds is incapable of fasting. So again, this goes back to the woman. If she fears that it's too much for her to fast, she can break her fast and then make it up after Ramadan. If she fears that by fasting it might have an impact on the child, either the child that she hasn't given birth to yet, or a child that she has given birth to but she's breastfeeding, again the decision goes back to her and she can seek medical advice about that. So she's treated the same. Of course, some scholars treat her differently, and they say that if she's pregnant or breastfeeding, it doesn't matter whether she's ill or not ill, or whether she can fast or not fast, she just feeds. She feeds one poor person per day, and she doesn't have to fast. And that's the position reported from Ibn Abbas. It's claimed that that's Ibn Abbas's opinion, and Ibn Umar's, but that needs to be revised any further. But it's a position held by some of the scholars and some of the Imams of Hadith. But the vast majority of scholars don't say that. The vast majority of scholars say that the pregnant woman and the breastfeeding woman is the same as anyone else. If she can fast, she fasts, and if she can't fast, she breaks her fast and makes it up after Ramadan. And we'll look at the case of the pregnant and breastfeeding woman later on, inshallah ta'ala. أو على سفر فمن كان منكم مريضا أو على سفر. So we've spoken about the one who's ill, now the one who's traveling. If somebody's traveling, they can break their fast. They have the option of breaking their fast. Allah has made it a general concession that if you are traveling, you can break your fast. And there is a consensus, an agreement, that the one who's traveling can break his fast, because it's repeated twice in the Quran. In 2 consecutive verses, Allah says, فَمَنْ كَانَ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ. And in the first verse, He says, فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ. So illness and travel are 2 explicit, clear reasons to break the fast. But the scholars discussed who's considered a traveller. When are you considered to be someone who's on travel? The position of most scholars, and this was an answer given by Ibn Abbas and Abdullah ibn Umar, they say that a person can travel the distance of, or that a person is considered a traveller who can take with these concessions when he's travelled at least 4 burud, which is equivalent to 16 farasikh, which contemporary scholars have calculated as being, some have said 90 kilometers, some have said 80 kilometers, and the position of the Hanabila is that it's 138 kilometers. 138 kilometers. That's the position of the later Hanbali scholars. So if somebody's travelled 85 miles, roughly, 138 kilometers is about 85 miles. Somebody's travelled about 85 miles, they can break their fast, they can shorten their prayers, etc. So that's Birmingham to London, that's Birmingham to Liverpool, that's Birmingham to Leeds, things like that. A person can break their fast, etc. Al-Imam Muwaffaq ad-Din ibn Qudama, the Shaykh of the Hanabila, as well as Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, the grandson, both of them say there is no limit to travel. You don't say that travel is 100 miles, or 50 miles, or 60 miles, or this number of miles. But travel goes back to what people consider to be travelling. They even say it goes back to the individual. If he sees himself to be travelling, then he can take with that concession. Why do they hold that opinion? Because they say Allah Ta'ala said, أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ, or they are travelling. So anyone who's travelling can break their fast. Anyone who's travelling can break their fast. That's what Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qudama say. So, is it possible for people to slightly disagree on that? It's possible. And some people, if they go from Birmingham to Leicester, for example, they don't feel that this is travel. I mean, to Leicester is and you can go from Birmingham to Leicester and back and get a job done and attend a meeting or whatever and return before Dhuhr. It's very close. It's 1 hour drive, 50-hour drive. Sorry, 50-minute drive and 50-hour drive. Depending on which part of Birmingham you're from. 50 hours would definitely be travel, with the consensus of the scholars. So some people might not consider Leicester to be enough of a journey, so they won't break their fast. And some people say, no, this is travel. I'm travelling. I'm on the motorway, I'm going for at least an hour, so this is travel. Possible. Just like the scholars disagreed on what's travel or not. So Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qudama don't consider that to be a problem. But if somebody went from Birmingham to Walsall, the people of Birmingham, they consider that travel? Walsall is not travel. In fact, most people don't even consider Walsall to be outside of Birmingham. Say Walsall is part of Birmingham. Okay, same with Coventry. Birmingham to Coventry is barely considered outside of Birmingham. So nobody would shorten for that, and they shouldn't shorten for that. Whereas everyone might agree that London to Glasgow is travel. Yeah? Especially if they're driving. 6 hour drive, 7 hour drive, yeah. So people would generally agree that that's travel. Okay, because if London to Glasgow is not travel, then there's no travelling in England. So it's a distance. It's not a type of regular journey that people would make. So as you can see, that this issue of travel is not an explicit thing. And this is because the Quran doesn't say this is travel. Nor does the Prophet ﷺ say this is travel. So we don't have anything that from the Sharia that clearly sets a boundary. And this is why there's so much disagreement. So Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah say, oh, there's disagreement. Such intricate differences sometimes. This person says this many miles and that person says this many miles. 5 mile difference, 3 mile difference. So they say, well, you need something to back this up. You need something strong enough to back this up. And so this is why the second position in the Hanbali school is that anything that's travel is travel. If you're in travel, you're short.
Does the travel have to be accompanied with difficulty? Because you might be able to take a flight from London to Glasgow, which might take you a lot less.
Sahih. And does travel have to include hardship? The answer is no. The answer is no. And this is because Allah made it a general concession in the Quran. أو على سفر, upon travel. And the Prophet ﷺ says, السفر قطعة من العذاب. This is the Prophet ﷺ's statement. السفر قطعة من العذاب. And the hadith is in the Sahih. Travel is a portion of punishment. Is a piece or a portion of punishment. And subhanAllah, I found this. Whenever I come back from travel, I'm always shattered. It could just be literally Leicester and back. It could be Manchester and back. It could be a distance that's not a huge difference. But there's something about travel that there's always something with it. Maybe a person doesn't feel tiredness at all. Say, no problem. No problem. Because the general rule is there. The general rule of travel is there. Travel often comes with hardship. And hardship doesn't just have to be illness. It's not like you have to fall ill when traveling. Or you have to be extremely tired when traveling. The issue of traveling, being away from home, not having everything in place as you naturally would, etc., all of that means that there is some form of hardship involved. Okay, time as well, you don't have the freedom that you do when you're at home, etc. All of that means that there's a concession to shorten the prayers and a concession to break the fast, even if there's no hardship. However, if you're traveling, do you have to break your fast? No. And those scholars who said you have to, their opinion is rejected with the explicit practice of the Prophet ﷺ. And like some of the Zahiriyya, who said you have to break your fast. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, لَيْسَ مِنَ الْبِرِّ الصِّيَامُ فِي السَّفَرِ. It is not from piety to fast during travel. It's not from piety to fast during travel. And this hadith is in the Sahihain. But the Prophet ﷺ fasted when he was traveling. He fasted when he was traveling. And this shows us the importance of, whenever talking about an issue, we have to gather all of the evidences. All the evidences on the issue, the whole life of the Prophet ﷺ on an issue, all of his teachings on an issue, then we can come to a conclusion. Because if you take one hadith on its own, or one verse on its own, you're going to come to conclusions that are incorrect, that contradict the teachings of the Messenger. And this is why, if somebody says it is not permissible to fast when traveling, we say the Prophet ﷺ fasted when traveling. And the hadith is in Sahihain. Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu reports that the Sahaba, or Jabir, I think Jabir ibn Abdullah, either Anas or Jabir, I think it's Jabir, he says that the Sahaba were traveling once with the Messenger ﷺ, and everyone broke their fast, except the Prophet ﷺ and Abdullah ibn Rawah. Only 2 people. Everyone else decided to break their fast. So the Messenger ﷺ fasted. Anas ibn Malik, in the hadith in Sahihain also, says that we would travel, some of us would be fasting, and some of us would be breaking our fast. And those who were fasting did not have a problem with those who broke. And those who broke their fast didn't have a problem with those who fasted. As for the hadith, it is not from piety to fast during travel. This is because somebody was fasting on a day which was very hot, and they were traveling, and they fell unconscious. So the Prophet ﷺ was told about this person who fell unconscious whilst fasting. So the Messenger ﷺ said, لَيْسَ مِنَ الْبِرِّ الصِّيَامُ فِي السَّفَرِ. And you fasted because you intended piety. You intended piety. But your piety was misplaced. Your piety was misplaced. Did this person fast with a bad intention? He fasted with a good intention. He wants to fast. He's tired, he's traveling, etc., but he wants to fast. Allah says, وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Fasting is better for you. So I want to fast. But that piety was misplaced. That piety was misplaced. And because it was misplaced at that particular time, the Prophet ﷺ made this statement. It's not from piety to fast during travel. So that means that if a person is in a situation of hardship, we say it's not from piety to fast when you're traveling. Because in this case, Islam doesn't come with hardship. In fact, as we will see, some of the verses that are upcoming, Allah Ta'ala says, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ الْيُسْرِ. Allah wants ease for you. وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرِ. He doesn't want hardship for you. So therefore, if fasting causes you severe hardship, you have contradicted the objective and the intention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in legislating fasting. Okay. One of the sisters asked about the issue of freeing a slave and having relations with one's wife whilst fasting in Ramadan. If we come to that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll talk about it in that particular point. Or we'll discuss it later on in more detail, but we'll answer the question now since the question has come. When it comes to relations with one's spouse, in the last verse of the series of 5 verses that talk about fasting, Allah Ta'ala says, أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ لَيْلَةَ الصِّيَامِ رَفَثُ إِلَى نِسَائِكُمْ. On the night of fasting, it's been permitted for you to come onto your wives, to have relations with your spouses. So it's permitted in the night. But during the day, relations with one's spouse is prohibited for the one who's fasting. What about the one who's not fasting during Ramadan? If you're not fasting during Ramadan, and both of you have a genuine excuse, then it's allowed for you to break your fast. And part of breaking the fast is relations. So in that case, relations is fine. Or both of you are traveling, husband and wife are both traveling. So they decide to break their fast. Can they do so? Yes, they can. However, if they're not traveling, and they're not ill, and they don't have an excuse to break the fast, and they have relations whilst fasting, then this requires the strictest of expiations upon the person, the kaffar. And we just mentioned this hadith of the man who came to the Prophet ﷺ, and this hadith is one of the most well-known hadith. All the books of hadith narrate this hadith. The man said, I had relations with my wife whilst fasting. Okay, relations means what? It means sexual intercourse. Anything less than that doesn't count as relations, and we'll come to that later. So if a person has sexual intercourse with their spouse whilst fasting, that breaks their fast, they have to repeat their fast, and they have to free a slave, which is not an option for people today really. If that's not available, which is the case generally speaking today, then they have to fast 2 consecutive months. 2 consecutive months. 2 consecutive months, that could be 29 days and it could be 30 days. Yeah. So if you're fasting complete months, then you fast the whole month, whether the month is 29 days or 30 days. So if you decide to fast, let's say you decide to fast, for example, Muharram and Rabi' al-Awwal. Muharram and Safar. You decide to fast Muharram and Safar, the first month of the Islamic calendar and the second month of the Islamic calendar. And they both turn out to be 29 days. So that means you'll have fasted for how many days? 58. Is that sufficient for you? Yes, it's sufficient. If a person can't fast 2 consecutive months, for whatever reason, then they move on to feeding 60 poor people. A full meal, 60 poor people, and that counts as a kafar. And they can feed those 60 poor people immediately, the moment they fall into this action during fasting, or they can do so at the end of Ramadan, or sometime where they can do it in.
And what would these months be? Right after Ramadan, or could they be winter months?
They can be winter months. They can be any time. Yeah. So when making up fasts, you can fast any time during the year. This is the position of the majority of the Sahaba. And they don't have to be consecutive. They don't have to be consecutive. A person can fast any time during the year. If it's the fasting of the one who's missed fasts in Ramadan, then they don't have to be consecutive. If it's the fasting of the one who's had intercourse, then these have to be consecutive. These have to be 60 consecutive days. And that consecutiveness and that continuation is not broken by a valid excuse. And this is the explicit statement of Malik and other scholars. Meaning, if a woman is fasting 60, generally a woman can't fast 60 consecutive days because she's going to have her menstrual cycle sometime during that month, generally speaking. So if that happens, we say no problem. During that menstrual cycle, you're not going to fast. As soon as it's finished, you have to continue fasting. You have to continue fasting until you reach 60 consecutive days.
And is that 60 consecutive days or just 2 months?
Well, now if she's broken that month thing, it's going to have to be 60 consecutive days, isn't it? Because we say either 2 months, 2 full months, or 60 consecutive days. If 2 full months isn't possible, for whatever reason, then it has to be 60 consecutive days. Same with the one who's traveling, or the one who's ill. Somebody's ill during the middle of the 60 consecutive days, he falls ill, can't fast. Do we say start the 60 again? No. Say that day you don't have to fast. Otherwise you're going to be continuously starting the 60 again and again and again. We say no problem, you break your fast on that day and then you continue until you... And that's a strict expiation. In fact, the Sharia has never obliged anyone to fast more than 60 consecutive days on anything. Even the punishment of killing. Even the punishment of killing, manslaughter, doesn't require more than 60 consecutive days. So that means this is as high as a punishment can get. Of course, some scholars consider that you have to fast 60 consecutive days if you break your fast intentionally. Whether that's with intercourse or anything else. Whether that's with intercourse or other things. And that's problematic, because that means a lot of people will be fasting a lot of days. And this is the position of the Hanafis. They say that food and drink and intercourse requires a kafara. And fortunately, Imam Ahmad and Shafi'i as well, and a number of scholars, they say this expiation only applies to jima', only applies to intercourse. So, Jazakumullah khair, they've given us a bit of, they've given people a bit of rukhsa. Yeah.
In regards to breaking a voluntary fast intentionally without any reason, is there expiation for that?
There's no expiation. Breaking a voluntary fast intentionally. Firstly, an obligatory fast outside of Ramadan doesn't require the kafara. Yeah? So if somebody is making up a fast from the last Ramadan, they're making up a fast from the last Ramadan, and they have intercourse with their spouse during that fast, is it an obligatory fast? Yes, it's obligatory, because they're making up a fast. But it doesn't require the kafara. It doesn't require the expiation. But they have to, of course, keep their fast for the rest of the day, and they have to make up their fast another time, another day. But a voluntary fast, if someone decides to fast, then Imam Malik rahimahullah says they shouldn't break their fast. But Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Shafi'i and Ishaq, all of them say that if someone fasts a voluntary fast on a certain day, they have the choice of breaking it if they wish. But they shouldn't break it without a proper excuse. Yeah? And a proper excuse doesn't have to be illness or something like that. It could be something less than that, but there should be a reason for it. It shouldn't just be, I just can't be bothered anymore. Okay, because a person has started an act of worship, وَلَا تُبْتِلُوا أَعْمَالَكُمْ, do not invalidate your actions, as Allah says in the Quran. So if we start a voluntary action, we should keep it. طيب. We'll finish this verse inshaAllah ta'ala, and then open up any discussions before we end for Salah. Allah ta'ala says, فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. So the one who breaks their fast due to travel or due to illness, then he should make them up on other days. Do they have to be consecutive? No. Do they have to be straight after Ramadan? No. In fact, Aisha radiallahu anha says, I would have fasts from Ramadan and I wouldn't make up those fasts until which month? Sha'ban. Sha'ban's the month we're in now. I wouldn't make those fasts up until Sha'ban because she had things to do. She wasn't able to make up those fasts. So that goes back to the question of fasting in winter. Somebody has 10 fasts that they've missed because of travel, or a woman has 7 fasts that she's missed because of menstruation. Can she wait for the winter days to come to make up the fast? Yes, she can. No problem. She has the choice of doing so. These fasts should be made up before the next Ramadan. They should be made up before the next Ramadan. So if somebody has fasts from last year, they should not have those fasts on them by the time the next Ramadan comes. They should have finished making them up. And the majority, when I say they should, most scholars say it's wajib. It's compulsory for them to make up those fasts before the next Ramadan. So anyone who fasts, anyone who has missed fasts and hasn't still made them up, now they only have 2 or 3 weeks or so to make them up. Yeah? They've got 2 or 3 weeks to make those fasts up, and it's compulsory to make them up now. It's compulsory to make them up now. And it's always better to make up fasts as soon as possible. Always better to make fasts as soon as possible. Why? Because sometimes we plan to make the fasts up. We say when the winter comes it's going to be easy. But the winter quickly passes by, we haven't made fasts up. And so we end up with the very long summer days now, and we're struggling to make up fasts and so on. So fasts should be made up as soon as possible. But if not, then before the next Ramadan. Allah Ta'ala then says, وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ يُطِيقُونَهُ فِدْيَةٌ طَعَامُ مِسْكِينٍ. And for those of you who are capable of fasting, then, and they decide not to fast, then they should feed a miskeen, those who are poor. There's a lot of discussion about this verse, because it seems to indicate that the one who's capable of fasting has the choice of not fasting, and if they decide not to fast, they can just feed one poor person per missed day. And this is why Abdullah ibn Abbas and Abdullah ibn Umar held 2 different opinions about this verse. Ibn Umar said it's an abrogated verse. It's an abrogated verse. Because at the beginning of Islam, those who wanted to fast can fast, and those who didn't want to fast could instead give a kaffara, a concession. This was like an introduction to fasting. Instead of the Sahaba, no one knows fasting, no one's used to fasting, and suddenly boom, 30 days of fasting. Instead, things were sort of introduced slowly. A person should fast, that's why Allah says straight after that, He says, وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. But if you fast, it's better for you. إِن كُنتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ, if only you knew. So there was an encouragement for people to fast. But if you didn't, then feed one poor person. Then in the following verse, Allah says, فَمَنْ شَهِدَ مِنْكُمُ الشَّهْرَ فَلْيَصُمْ. Whoever of you witnesses the month, then he should fast it. So Ibn Umar and a number of other companions say, the second verse abrogated the verse before it. Previously it was optional to fast Ramadan, and now it became compulsory to fast Ramadan. Or previously it was obligatory or an optional to fast, then it became obligatory to fast Ramadan. Ibn Abbas says it's not abrogated. It's not abrogated. This verse is not abrogated, but this verse is referring to those people who are no longer capable of fasting so easily. And in another recitation, وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ يُطَوَّقُونَهُ فِدْيَةٌ طَعَامُ مِسْكِينٍ. And those who force themselves, they have to push themselves to fast. They don't find it so easy to fast. Ibn Abbas says this is referring to the elderly man and the elderly woman who struggle to fast, they're incapable of fasting, they struggle to fast. For them, they can feed one poor person a day. And this is why anyone who's elderly, man or woman, and their age makes them in a condition which doesn't allow them to fast. Do they have to fast? So you don't have to fast. Do you have to make it up after Ramadan? No, you don't have to make it up after Ramadan, because after Ramadan the situation is probably going to get worse. Because old age is not going to get, you're not going to get younger and younger, you're going to get older and older. So you're not going to make up the fast, but instead you can feed one poor person per day. The same rule applies to the one who is, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it terminal? The one who's terminally ill. The one who is ill long term. They don't expect to recover. Doesn't mean it's impossible to recover. Allah Ta'ala is able to do all things. But they don't expect to recover. The likelihood is that this is a long-term permanent illness. And that illness stops them from fasting. What do? They feed one poor person per day. So this verse applies to two types of people. The elderly person and the one who is ill, a long-term illness, incapable of fasting. Instead of fasting, they feed one poor person per day. If the elderly person finds his youth again, or this ill person finds that he's recovered, alhamdulillah. He's recovered from his illness and therefore he thinks that he can fast. Say alhamdulillah, now start fasting. And those previous fasts, you don't have to make them up. You've paid the kafar, the fidya for them, and there's no issue. طيب. Before we look at some of the questions, we'll finish the statement of this verse. Allah Ta'ala says, فَمَنْ تَطَوَّعَ خَيْرًا فَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَهُ. And the one who volunteers to do good, then that's better for him. وَأَنْ تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. And this kind of supports the position of those who say it's abrogated, because it seems like the verse is indicating that paying a fidya, feeding the poor, is permissible. But if you volunteer to do good, i.e. to fast, that's better for you. وَأَنْ تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. Then Allah Ta'ala speaks about some of the other rulings that relate to fasting, and that's in the following three verses, which we'll look up in the upcoming lessons bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. We'll look at some of the comments that the sisters have, and then if any of the brothers have any other comments, we'll also look at them inshallah. So hopefully the question about the relations with one's spouse has been answered. Hopefully that's clear. If it's not clear, sisters, you can point it out. Giving zakat to an orphan, when do you give it? Before Ramadan or in Ramadan? What if the orphan is a girl who's looked after her brother? Is she still liable for zakat? Firstly, zakat doesn't have a time. I know that people have a habit of giving zakat during Ramadan, and that's fine, because people want to give zakat during a time which is a time of mercy, a time of reward, a time in which reward is multiplied, etc. That's not a problem. A person can give zakat during Ramadan. But in reality, zakat becomes compulsory when the year has passed. That's when zakat becomes compulsory. So each person is going to look at when their money reached the nisab, and the nisab is the minimum amount of wealth that a person needs to have kept for a whole year before zakat becomes obligatory. So if you've had a certain amount of wealth for a whole year, and that year has passed, zakat should be given straight away. You shouldn't wait till Ramadan, because that means you're delaying your zakat, you're delaying an obligation. However, if Ramadan comes early, Ramadan comes before the time of zakat is due, can you give it in Ramadan? Yes, you can give it in Ramadan. There's no issue. So that's up to you. It can be before Ramadan, during Ramadan, after Ramadan, so long as it's within the time. As for is she liable if she's looked after her brother, an orphan? Zakah is given to the one who's poor. Zakah is given to the one who's poor. Allah has laid out the categories of those who are eligible to receive zakah in Surah At-Tawbah. And there are 8 categories. And the first two are the poor and the needy. إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينَ. And the orphans are not mentioned in this verse. So therefore, the orphan is eligible to receive zakah if they're poor, or they're needy, or they fall under one of these categories. That's it. So, if she's being looked after by a brother who is very rich and capable of looking after her, and she doesn't have a problem, she can be given gifts. If you want to make her feel better, or you want to give her something, that's fine as a gift or as a sadaqah, not a problem. But zakah is only given to these 8 categories. So if an orphan is poor, whether she's looked after a sibling or a parent or a relative or not, if she's poor, she can be given zakah, whether she has someone looking after her or not, because zakah is given to those who are in need or in poverty. As for someone who is wealthy, she's from a wealthy family, but you kind of, maybe you want to do something for her, you want to put a smile on her face, you want to do something kind to her, so not a problem, but it won't be from zakah. It won't be from zakah because this person's not eligible for zakah, because zakah has specific recipients. So that's that. Brothers, any comments before we... No, follow.
In relation to the person who is terminally ill or old and they have to feed, say 30 people for the month, when do they feed them? Before the month, every day, or after?
No. When it comes to feeding those who are terminally ill or elderly, we said they have to feed 1 poor person per day, which is going to be 29 or 30 days. They can do so at the beginning of the month, but at the beginning of the month they would give, they can feed 30 people, for example. They can do so in the middle of the month, and they can do so at the end of the month. And all of this is reported from the practice of the Salaf. So therefore the matter is, alhamdulillah, flexible. There's flexibility there. A person can feed during the month, before or after, and the earlier they do it, the better. The earlier they do it, the better. But there's flexibility. It's not like if the first day passes and you haven't fed, the person is sinful. No. There is scope with that, and that's the position of most of the fuqaha. Tfadal.
In regard to traveling, maybe breaking the fast, break it or not break it?
Is it more rewarding to break the fast or to fast during Ramadan if you're traveling?
Yeah, it falls under the first.
No. If you're traveling, and is it better to fast or is it better to break? We know that both are permissible, but is it better to do this one or this one? Imam Malik says it's better to fast, because Allah says in the Quran, وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ, that you fast is better for you. However, Sa'id ibn Musayyib and Imam Ahmad and Ishaq ibn Rahawayh and Abu Thawr and a number of scholars of hadith say breaking the fast is better. Why is breaking the fast better? They use the other verse. Allah says, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرِ, Allah wants ease for you. وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرِ. And when the Prophet ﷺ was asked by someone, and the hadith is in Sahih Muslim and elsewhere as well, he said to him, O Messenger of Allah, I find myself strong and I can fast during travel. Should I fast or should I break it? He said, it is a concession that Allah has given you. It's a rukhsa, a concession Allah has given you. So if you take it, فَهُوَ حَسَنٌ. فَإِنْ أَخَذْتَ بِهَا فَحَسَنٌ. So if you take with that concession, it's better, it's good. It's good. And if you fast, فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكَ. If you fast, there's no harm. So this seems to indicate that to take with the concession is preferred. However, the evidences are very close in this. The opinions of the fuqaha are very close in this. Position of Imam Ahmad and Ishaq ibn Rahawayh is that breaking is better, and the position of the other scholars and many scholars is that it's an option, completely optional, and the person does what is most appropriate. If there's more hardship, then they should break. If there is more ease, then they should fast, so that they don't have to worry about the stresses of making up the fast after that and then maybe missing it, etc. No, go on.
Let's say you're a contractor and you work.
Is this a different question?
Following on.
Tayyib, go on.
To traveling. So about traveling. Let's say you're a contractor and you're a contractor following the Ramadan, and you have to travel most of the Ramadan to another city, which again falls under the traveling category.
No.
Let's say about 20 or 25 days of the.
No.
Can you break it?
Concessions apply. Concessions apply. If you're traveling for 30 days a month, concessions apply. Because Allah Ta'ala says, فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ. The one who's traveling or upon ill or traveling. Traveling allows breaking the fast full stop, even if it's regular travel. So long as it's actual travel, and it's a distance that constitutes travel. If it happens regularly, then you have the option of breaking the fast. But, of course, we say, if the traveling is not troubling you, and you're not finding it difficult, then someone might advise to fast, so that you don't have to end up fasting 30 days after that, and then stressing when the next Ramadan comes close, and so on. But if you felt that you wanted to break your fast, that's completely optional, because you consider it to be traveling. One here, and then he had his hand up after that, and we'll come back to you.
What's the opinion if someone has got fast to make up, but then again, Shawwal approaches, they're thinking, okay,
Sha'ban.
Shawwal, the month of Shawwal after.
So Ramadan, next Ramadan's come.
Yeah.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, it's Ramadan now. You've got some fast to make up.
Yes.
And then it's gone past Ramadan and it's now
Shawwal.
Shawwal,
Yeah.
and you want to observe Shawwal. But however, you're thinking, okay, if you have to make up for the fasting Shawwal, maybe because of the change of weather now, it's longer days, so you want to leave it till it's winter. So what's the best thing to do? Should you just do the Shawwal and then make up?
The best thing to do is to fast obligatory fasts first, without doubt. The best thing to do, not without doubt, because the scholars disagree, but that's the best thing to do with most scholars. We don't want to make it sound like only one opinion exists. But the better thing to do is to fast obligatory fasts first. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, as well as Ishaq and others, say this. Why? Because this is an obligation upon you. It's an obligation. And if you've already missed fasts and the whole year has passed, then it's quite likely that you're going to end up fasting 6 days of Shawwal and then maybe missing fasts again. It's possible. So to not put ourselves in that situation, we want the first thing to do is to fast the obligatory fasts. If we can fast the month of Shawwal, 6 days in Shawwal, brilliant. If we can't fast 6 days in Shawwal, then fast 3 days every month after Shawwal, and the reward is exactly the same. And there's no difference between that and between the fasts of Shawwal. And that's something that a lot of people don't pay attention to. They think that if the 6 fasts of Shawwal go, that means all the reward is finished. The reward continues throughout the year. And then we'll continue.
Sheikh, when we speak about travelling and the traveller can break his fast, does this mean he breaks his fast, or he has the option of not starting the fast in the first place? Say if you're on Musafir on the second day of your travel, should you start your fast and then break it, or just not fast in the first place?
And so you're intending to fast after Dhuhr, you're intending to travel after Dhuhr, for example.
For example, you're Musafir and it's the second day, you wake up on the second day, you're still Musafir, you can still shorten the prayer. On that day, should you start your fast?
You don't have to.
That's
so long as a person is still travelling, they can begin the day not fasting. So long as they're still travelling. The only issue comes in is if you're not travelling, but you're planning to fast, travel in the evening, for example, after Dhuhr or after Asr. You should wake up fasting. You should wake up fasting, because something may happen, travel doesn't go ahead. And then Allah Ta'ala says, "Oh, ala safar," upon travel. In this case, you're not upon travel. And this is why the majority of scholars do not allow you to break your fast until you've started your journey. And so, if it's a case of you're already traveling, and on the second day of travel you wake up, you don't want to fast at all. From the beginning you start having breakfast, no problem, because you're on travel. But if you're not traveling yet, but you're planning to travel, then in this case you should start the day fasting, and then when travel comes, you travel.
Even if you started your travel in the beginning of the day.
Sorry?
Even if you started your travel in the beginning of the day, around 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
So do you still start, not have breakfast?
And there's scope. Imam Ahmad and the majority of scholars say you should start fasting, and then have breakfast when you've started the journey, because you're still not on travel. And again, something may occur, and travel doesn't go ahead or whatever. So because of that, they say, keep away from breaking your fast until you're certain you're not traveling. But if somebody did break their fast, they have some scholars to support that position, alhamdulillah. And it's the practice of some of the companions, like Anas ibn Malik. So it's not a foreign opinion or a strange opinion. It's time for Salat Isha, so we'll leave it at that, and we'll continue next week after Maghrib bi'idhnillah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
My question was